It's time for the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith. Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So as we're paying attention, you're seeing this well-funded, well-planned out assault on public education. And we're really witnessing, quite frankly, the corporatization, the sanitation, and the complete rewriting of our history in a way that, well, we working people, maybe we're never going to learn the power of us coming together and the power that working people have. As longtime listeners of the program know, back in 2013, we did a labor history tour, took us coast to coast. And, out of that came Daddy, What's the Middle Class? You can get that at our website. But what we learned is, labor history, virtually corporatized, virtually rewritten, but for the passions of a few educators, the courageous educators who want to keep this alive. And you may remember, we went to Blair Mountain, where they literally removed the town and wanted to take the mountain with them. That's why I think we're in a moment. Because one of the stops we made on the tour was in Memphis, Tennessee, to talk about the 1968 sanitation strike that took Dr. Martin Luther King to Memphis and ultimately to his death. And look, the reality is this is a perfect moment to talk about workers' history, to talk about civil rights history, and to bring it in a way that people are going to learn from, get a little historic context from. And that's why I'm thrilled to see that our friends over at AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, have chosen this moment to produce a multi-episode podcast titled the I Am Story podcast that is bringing workers' rights, civil rights, community rights, human rights together. And that's why I've asked AFSCME President Lee Saunders to come share some thoughts with us and maybe get a little context. Lee, thanks for taking time for us.
Glad to be with you, Rick.
So tell me, I've been talking about civil rights and labor rights and the history of the two and how they work together. To me, this should be the number one story taught in school if you're going to talk about either or both of those things. Why do you think it's not?
Well, you have people who don't want us to understand our history and the importance of our history. I have a saying, and a lot of people have heard it, where if you are trying to get somewhere and you understand where you've got to go, you've got to understand where you've been. And that history is so important. The history of the labor movement is so important. The history of civil rights is so important. And we have got to teach that. Regardless of people trying to take it away from us, these are important pieces of American history. And that's the purpose of this podcast, the I Am Story, because it goes back to 1968 when you had 1,300 African-American sanitation workers who were being disrespected, mistreated, not being treated like human beings. And they decided that enough was enough. They worked on those trucks every single day, picking up the trash, providing an essential service to the citizens of Memphis. Yet they worked in unhealthy conditions with low pay, low benefits, and they did not have a seat at the table. And they decided they wanted to have a union represent them. And the city blocked it, Local 1733 of AFSCME. The city blocked it. And they kept on fighting and they kept on pushing. But the tipping point was when two sanitation workers getting out of bad weather in Memphis went into the back of a sanitation truck, and the equipment malfunctioned, and the crusher in that truck went down on them, and they were killed. And the sanitation workers had said that there were malfunctions in those trucks and had told the city that day after day after day, and they ignored it. And that was the breaking point where the sanitation workers said, enough is enough, and we've got to make our voices heard.
No, and the amazing thing is look, we both know throughout history, the names, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, if not for this, are forgotten to history. And there are thousands of other people, throughout our course of history that the moment didn't spark. What was it about this moment that this spark caught? What do you think that was that Because as I've said, we've heard stories of, thousands of workers who have been killed on the job and forgotten to history. What was it about this one that was different?
It was so real to them, and they had been fighting these issues for so long and bringing them to the attention of a government that didn't care about them, bringing it to the attention of the city council and the mayor who did not care about them. And sooner or later, you have that breaking point, Rick, where you say, we can't do this anymore. We've got to do something differently. And that's what happened when they walked off the job. They said enough was enough. And if you recall, they walked around with those signs. This happened a little bit later, but they walked around with those signs that simply said, I am a man. Very simple slogan, but it said a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
It talked about their plight and who they were. And what happened in Memphis, Tennessee, when the community came together, when the religious community came together, the clergy, when the families came together and said, enough is enough, and we've got to make our voices heard. And Dr. King understood the importance of this strike. If you recall, he was planning the Poor People's March. And he read about the strike and talked to an individual named Dr. James Lawson, who was a religious leader in Memphis, Tennessee. And Dr. Lawson was telling him about the struggle and the fact that if he believed, and he knew that he believed in the connection between civil rights and human rights and economic and racial justice, then Dr. King would have to travel to Memphis and stand up for those workers. And that's exactly what Dr. King did, even when some of his closest advisors were telling him, don't go to Memphis. We're planning something much more important. Dr. King essentially said, I've got to support these workers. This is what I'm all about. And he galvanized that whole community, and the community came together to fight and make their voices heard.
No, it's an important bit of history to remember. And I think back to when we were in Memphis talking about this on our tour back in 2013. And what we found across the country when talking about labor history and the plight of workers fighting for better wages, hours, and conditions, and the places that were successful, it was the pulling together of the community. It was religious leaders coming together. It was a unity that it wasn't just the handful of workers that were benefiting. It was all of us. It was everybody involved. And I think that's an important lesson that I think has to be learned today again.
I think you're exactly right. It has to be people who share the same kinds of concerns, who want justice, who want a seat at that table, who don't want to be mistreated, coming together and saying that we cannot take this anymore, and we aren't going to take it anymore. And we're going to make our voices heard every single day. You look at what's happening in this country today, with our freedoms basically being under attack, whether it's civil rights, whether it's education, whether it's issues affecting abortion, all of those kinds of issues. Voting rights, those freedoms are under attack, and people have got to come together and say enough is enough. And there is power in numbers when people are reacting to something and believe that those freedoms are under attack, then we can make a difference in this country. And that's what we've got to do. That's what those sanitation workers did in 1968. Yeah. That's what we've got to do now.
No, and look, this is a perfect time for this, I think, as the interest in labor is at an all-time high, at least in my lifetime, where we're seeing a lot of organizing happening. We're seeing some strikes going on. This idea that we can make things better for the future. Inflation's crazy. We've had 40 years of stagnant and declining wages. We've got a working class under assault. It's these stories of struggle, these stories of victory that ultimately I hope will educate people and move them in the right direction. But this wasn't an easy victory. I mean, we like to look back on things in the past with kind of, rose glasses. This was a hard-fought struggle. These were people, real sufferers, really suffering. And I think your podcast did a good job of grabbing some of that and saying, look, this was hard on families. This was hard on the communities. This was tough stuff.
Well, in our podcast, we tried to recreate the moment. And we have we're going to have 6 podcasts which talk about the strike in different segments, where we are talking with people like Reverend Lawson, who lives in California now. He's still living. and he shared with us what was going on then. We talked to Bill Lucy, who was then an executive assistant to President Jerry Worf of AFSCME. He then became the Secretary Treasurer of AFSCME, and he was there from the beginning, working with those sanitation workers. We talked with Martin Luther King III, and he shared his father's vision and the reasons why he believed, Dr. King believed, that he must go to Memphis to bring this together, to bring the community together, to have one single voice, to fight back these kinds of injustices. And then we talked with the actual sanitation workers, present and those who are retired now, who participated in the strike, to get their feelings about what was happening, what has changed, what remains the same. And so we bring this all together in these podcasts because this is an important part of our history. And people have got to understand that if, in fact, you come together and you identify what needs to be fought for, then we can win. We can win if you come together and form that large community that they were able to form in Memphis, and that we can do right now to fight the injustices that exist.
And you could take on City Hall. Look, one of the podcast episodes talked about, the union organizers going in to talk to the mayor, and the mayor thinking that he's John Wayne with a gun under the table.
Gun in the room. Yep.
It's one of those things that when you start to think about the force and the power that these workers had to overcome, the violence in the street by police, the constant attacks, but yet they still moved forward because as the saying is, they were fighting for their humanity.
They were fighting for their humanity. And Dr. King understood that. And Dr. King ultimately gave his life in support of that strike and in support of the humanity of those workers. And we can never, ever forget that. And people would like to erase it from the history books, but we can't let them do that.
Yeah.
That is an important part of our history, and we've got to teach our youngsters and our people that, what happened in this country that was good didn't just magically fall from the sky. It came from organization and our communities mobilizing and fighting back and making their voices heard.
And this is why, again, back in 2013, we did our labor history tour. In 2015, we did a civil rights tour to talk about labor's involvement in the civil rights movement. It's important to remember these things, to pass them on to the next generation. And I think of my own kids. Part of the reason we did these tours is, part for the radio show and the TV show we do, but also for my kids to give them a rounder depth to their understanding of history. And this is what's frustrating in this moment for me, Lee. There is a movement in this country that wants to completely sanitize what our kids are exposed to and have an education curriculum that doesn't include labor's history or civil rights history or who we are as a country. It's kind of frightening to me.
Well, that's not an education at all, is it? That's not an education at all.
No, it's more like an indoctrination, but I was giving them
when you exclude those very important points in our history. That's not about education. It's about trying to control, okay? And taking away what they don't want to talk about or want to hear. And they don't want their children to hear it or their communities to hear it because they have a different agenda. And that agenda is not to support working families or our communities or people of color. And that agenda is not to talk about economic justice and labor rights and racial justice. That's not their agenda. Their agenda is to control in the strongest possible way they can by limiting the kind of information that people should understand and know about.
You're listening to The Rick Smith Show here with AFSCME President Lee Saunders. You want to check out their website, afscme.org is the site. We'll get links out. If you want to check out the podcast, most certainly we'll get links out to the I Am Story podcast. You can take a look at that. I want to get your thoughts on there's this weird kind of dynamic going on. Our billionaire class has all the money, doing a masterful job slicing and dicing and tearing us apart based on race, on gender, on color, whatever dividing lines they can come up with. To me, this podcast series, it shows that you can overcome this. I look at the Bread and Roses strike, the 1912 Lawrence textile strike, a way to get over multiple language barriers and bring people together. I look at this as one of those things where white and black. Let me ask you this way then. How much did race play into this, given the fact that AFSCME was led by a white guy and was predominantly black workers? How important was that, and how did they overcome it?
Well, I think it was extremely important that the union, headed by Jerry Worth, who was the president then, understood that there had to be a connection and labor had a responsibility to fight for these workers. And he sent Bill Lucy, who was African American, who was his executive assistant, down to organize and mobilize those communities. He got it. And Jerry Worth stood for the fact that if a worker was being mistreated, whether that worker was black, white, whatever color they were, they needed to have a seat at the table and representation by a union. And that's why he jumped in to this effort. And he traveled to Memphis on many occasions to fight for those workers. He connected arms when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. went down to Memphis. And they both understood that with that connection, in talking about labor rights, in talking about civil rights, in talking about economic justice, then that would be a powerful force that you could not deny. And would the fight be hard? Sure it would be. Sure it would be. But in the end, those workers were able to win. And we can never forget the fact that regardless of the struggle and the loss of life and what those workers were going through there, they were able to achieve a contract. They were able to be represented by a union. And that fight continues today. Make no mistake about it. I mean, you still have forces in the society who don't believe in strong unions. They don't want workers to have a seat at that table, and they will fight against it every single day. You look at the new organizing that's taking place in this country, whether it's Amazon, okay, whether it's Walmart, whether it's Starbucks, whether it's certain areas in the public sector where people do not want to give up that power. And they don't want to share that power with workers. And we know that's wrong. And I believe that the majority of Americans know that's wrong. 70% of Americans believe that unions are absolutely necessary in this country right now to be a counterbalance and counterforce. But the deck sometimes is stacked against us because the labor laws in this country are so archaic and they block attempts by unions, and not only unions, but workers to organize themselves into a powerful force.
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you. I mean, because it's often framed in a way that, I win, you lose. These scenarios have to be, there's winners and losers instead of, look, I mean, an injury to one is an injury to all. And when you do better, I'm going to do better. And this is kind of the moment where I think, and again, I think this podcast series is important in this moment because it ties those themes together. Because right now we're being torn apart. Now it's not so much, it's still white, black, but a lot of it's gender now. I talk to a lot of my working class friends and it all comes down to, we're fighting against this person's right or that person's right. And I say at the end of the day, I may not understand all of it, but in the workplace, everyone should have the dignity of a decent wage, of decent benefits, of safe working conditions. That should be a non-starter, I think.
And that's what unions do. And that's what our allies believe in, that people deserve that. Workers deserve that. And nobody should try to take that away from workers who are providing essential services, who are doing the right thing, who are trying to play by the rules every single day, but in many cases being mistreated and abused at the work site. And that's what unions are all about. And that's why we've got to continue to come together. But it's going to take more than just the labor unions in this country. It's going to take a mass movement in this country of people who believe that everyone deserves a chance. Everybody needs to be treated with dignity and respect. And that includes on the job and off the job. And we've got to continue to fight for that.
There you go. Last line of questioning I've got for you. With this podcast series coming out, what are you hoping comes out of this? It's well produced. It's educational. It's informative. It was riveting. I was riding my bike listening to the whole thing. In fact, rode longer than I probably should have. What are you hoping comes out of this?
We just want people to understand. And we want people to connect with what was happening and the power that people have when we come together to make change. And it's not impossible. If those sanitation workers were successful in their fight, even with all of the misery and all of the sacrifices that were made by so many people, if they were successful in that fight, and they were, then we can continue to be successful in the fights that we're engaged in today. And we want people to make that connection and don't throw up your hands and walk away and say, it doesn't matter. It does matter. It does matter, but we've got to make our voices heard and fight for it. And that's exactly what we're going to do.
There you go. The podcast series, the I Am Story podcast. We'll get links out on social media, how you can take a look at that. Lee, I appreciate the time. Good stuff. Hope you'll come back and talk to us again soon.
I'd be happy to, Rick. Good seeing you.
All righty. Lee Saunders, president of AFSCME, AFSCME.org, the website. Want to hear your thoughts? You got stories? You got questions, comments? Want to hear it? Rick at thericksmithshow.com. Back after this. Stick around.
Hey, this is Ken Casey from the Dropkick Murphys, and you're listening to The Rick Smith Show. From the steel mills of Pennsylvania, to the auto factories of Michigan, to the modern makers movement, manufacturing makes our nation great. I'm Scott Paul, president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. We bring business and labor together to advocate for policies that everyone can agree on. Together, we can strengthen manufacturing and create good-paying American jobs. Help us keep it made in America.
The old factory towns in America's heartland have been taking a beating. Thing is, though, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Unions are making a comeback. More organizing in the last couple of years than in a long time. And the Biden administration being more supportive of unions than any president since FDR. We're finally turning things around after 40 years of screwing over working people. But will we keep moving in the right direction? That's our choice as Americans.
Indigenous people have been saying that we feel a shift in the climate for decades. Climate change is here. The time is now to pass the torch on to the next generation of clean energy warriors. We need to put the land back to work for our people. That means creating jobs for them to live and thrive in our communities. The time is now. Congress must invest in clean energy.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
It really is an amazing story if you stop and think about it. And the fact that this isn't one of the central things taught in our schools is really quite a shame. I mean, it does bring together the struggle of workers to earn a decent wage and to be respected, of a community of organizing to make lives better, of a civil rights movement seeking to create equality and just to demand being recognized as human. It's always amazing me that this was never taught in school, and I didn't learn about it in school either. Which is why when we did our labor history tour, Memphis was one of the spaces we had to stop, because this is an important moment in not just labor's history, but in the history of this country, of the civil rights movement, of the movement of just being part of the working class. And the fact that it's not taught in schools is well, not surprising, I guess. And, as I've said, we did those tours in 2013 and 2015, a labor history tour and a civil rights tour, labor's involvement in the civil rights movement in 15, where we went to all of these places that corporate interests and, the moneyed folks were attempting to rewrite it. And as I've said about, civil rights history in this country, we went to a bunch of places in the South where black people were treated horribly. I mean, just some of the worst kind of moments of man's inhumanity to man. And now there's a museum, there's an institute, there's a tourist trap. Hey, look how bad we were. Bring us your money. And, while they are, tourist traps, they're educational. And this is the reason we took our kids there. And then the reason I support a more well-rounded education than what I got, and why, again, there's this movement of moneyed interests fighting to ensure that our kids don't get that well-rounded education. Because the last thing the wealth class in this country wants is for us to wake up and realize that we've outprocreated them. There are more of us. They may have all the money, but we can vote for what we need. We can do collectively the things that we can't do individually. And that to me is part of what a well-rounded education is going to bring us, and why I think this period, this podcast that AFSCME's put out is important, but also from an educational standpoint, why this should be one of the pieces of core curriculum taught. It's not going to happen, but it should be. I want to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break, right back.
I've been driving buses for 5 years, and my day-to-day routine is I wake up a little earlier than most people. I get on a bus, I go out, I pick up some students and make sure they get to school nice and safe. Here in Fairbanks, Alaska, that can be a challenge because of the winter weather and the icy roads. But I love the job. So the Teamsters are great. They provide us a lot of protections. They've always taken care of their people, made sure that our jobs were secure. We didn't have to worry about whether or not we'd have a job from day to day.
And that's amazing, because before we'd be working 4, 6, 8 hours a day and only earning minimum wage. Was real difficult to make a living. And then the Teamsters pushed a lot, so we make something we can live off of and not have to have a second job. What absolutely gives me peace of mind, the union membership allows me to focus on this job without having to worry about whether or not my family is going to be taken care of. I'm Andrew Case, and I'm proud to be Teamsters Local 959.
Before we close the program, we want to take a moment to thank our viewers and to share a little bit about why we do what we do. At the Rick Smith Show, we believe that media today is almost entirely controlled by corporate greed. So we have now 24-hour news channels. But instead of 24 hours of news, what we get is 1 hour repeated 24 times, and with tons of commercials creating obscene amounts of profits. Information once presented as a public service has now become a private commodity. So when lies make money, lies are what we get. We get a corporate-controlled rage machine feeding us anger and hate, trying to convince us that our problems are right, left, or red, blue, when they are and always have been up, down, the wealthiest 1% versus the rest of us. Our goal is to be an alternative to that machine, not as a news show with a fancy journalist out front, but as a talk show run by a union truck driver and a team of working-class heroes just like you. Everything we do, both what we get right and what we get wrong, is dedicated to advancing the interests of America's working families. No corporate ad buys, no think tanks, no focus groups, no talking points. We are media by working people, for working people. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you back here next time.